I would like to go to our next speaker. Tonight, our next speaker, distinguished Toastmaster John Morse, is delivering the third speech in his Oh My Gosh, Am I Speaking Tonight series. In his first speech, he addressed the issue of choosing subject matter on which you can speak without spending a great deal of time or anxiety. In Oh My Gosh, Am I Speaking Tonight Part 2, he focused on an easy way to organize your speech without much preparation. Tonight's assignment comes from the Advanced Speakers Series Specialty Speeches, Project 1, Speaking Off the Cuff. In this assignment, John has tasked me with choosing from a list of 5 titles, the subject of his presentation tonight. So, the title of his speech tonight is, Oh My Gosh, Am I Speaking Tonight, Part 3. And the subject or title is, Books That Will Grip You and May Even Cause You to Think. Please unmute yourself and with a hearty Carolwood Toastmasters sustained round of applause, foot stomping, whistling, and boisterous cheering, help me to welcome distinguished Toastmaster John Morse. Woo! The floor is yours, John.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and guests. Behind me, you'll see a library of books, and some of them have gripped my imagination. Some of them have been my partners for the period of time while we've been in COVID-19. Not being able to go to the movies, not being able to go out, I've done a good deal of reading about history, about politics, about other things that interest me. However, tonight I want to bring to your attention some books that I think you ought to consider reading, particularly because they deal with our present culture and they deal with the state of Florida. First, the book that I want to mention is a book by Patrick Smith. I don't know how many of you have read Land Remembered. Raise your hands if you've read it. I don't see any hands up. 1, 2 hands. All right. Thank you, Brenda, and thank you also, Andy. Land Remembered is such a fantastic story about one particular family. It is about the McIver family. It starts in 1850 or 1860, runs all the way up to the 1960s or the 1970s. It goes from one generation to the next, to the next, and to the next. It is fiction. It is a fictionalized version of the history of Florida. And what a remarkable history it is, because it starts out with our history of being a cattle ranching state. We raised cattle on a free range, and that's what our economy in large measure was based upon. The McIvers were very much involved in that. Times changed. Times changed because farmers took over and barbed wire fences began to be erected, and there were no longer any opportunities for those fantastic cattle drives from one part of the state to another. And what happened then was that beginning in the turn of the century, we changed from a cattle ranching state, although we still raise a lot of cattle in Florida, to agriculture. The citrus crop became such a gigantic part of our life. McIvers went from one family raising and pursuing the cattle industry to another family beginning and pursuing the citrus crop. And from there they went on to becoming, in the 1920s, land barons, because land was cheap. And there was so much of it, and people wanted to come to Florida. That's what drove the economy in large measure. And McIvers were no exception. You follow them all the way through to the 1960s. And if you ever want to read a story that will grip you, that will entertain you, and that also will educate you along the way, read Patrick Smith's Land Remembered. It is, without a doubt, a classic. I strongly recommend it. Going from that particular book, I want to talk about a couple of other books, more recent in vintage. They were both written by a gentleman by the name of Colson Whitehead. Is anybody familiar with Colson Whitehead? Raise your hand if you are. I don't see any hands raised yet. Colson Whitehead wrote a number of fictional stories. The first he wrote was a story about the Underground Railroad. It was set in about 1840 or 1835. It was an amazing story of Cora, a young lady who managed to leave the plantation. The plantation was located in Georgia. She went to South Carolina. Then she went to North Carolina. She was pursued by slave hunters. She was pursued by any number of other people who wanted to see her fail or wanted to see the runaway slaves captured and taken. Cora was and is a remarkable story about the Underground Railroad. I strongly recommend that you read it, because right now it is a 10-part series on prime time, Amazon Prime. That's what it is. It's on Amazon Prime. It's a fantastic series, and it's a wonderful, wonderful read. He followed that up with another book that I strongly recommend, and that book happens to be the story of the Nichols Boys. The Nichols Boys is a story adapted from something that happened here in Florida as well. What happened in Florida was that we had a juvenile delinquency home in Marianna, Florida, that was awful. It was terrible. It was a disaster. And the young man ended up there, his trials and tribulations leading him to escape and return elsewhere, are a story that you will not forget. For his effort, Colson Whitehead was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction, first for the Underground Railroad, and then for the Nichols Boys. Very, very few authors anywhere in history have been awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes in nonfiction. The world and the libraries are full of books that will amaze you. I strongly urge you to read. And if you do read these 3 books, I know that you will enjoy them. Mr. Toastmaster.
You have the floor.
John Morse, thank you so much for having the courage to speak off the cuff like a pro. This is a unique project, and I did a little bit of research, and I'm saying, where the heck does off the cuff come from? And one theory is that it comes from the practice of recording bar tabs on a bartender's cuff. It came around in around 1938. So another theory is that actors would jot down notes on their sleeves when they didn't fully learn their lines, similar to what students do today when they write notes on their hands or their wrists. You did a wonderful job of storytelling, as you often do. A synonym for off the cuff is wing it or vamp, and you certainly excelled at that today. You appeared professional. You dressed in a suit. One opportunity for engagement in the future is to set up your camera with the camera not being on so we don't see that little bit of subtle movement. I loved the title of your book, of your speech, books that will grip you, even if you don't necessarily, they will get you to think also, which is not easy when you're sort of preparing for 5 possible speeches. I liked your language, such as when you talked about books being your partners in COVID. Your gestures were very lively, but I think, again, the challenge is in our Zoom environment to make those gestures a little bit higher and not quite so fast. You had wonderful vocal variety, as you often do. I liked that you really had emotion when you talked about the MacGyvers and you talked about the impact that that had. And one opportunity, I think, in respect to this project is to tell us a little bit more about how prolific a reader you are, because that's part of your authority to speak in this particular project. Now, with respect to some of the evaluation guide, which I emailed to the members earlier, you definitely are a consummate storyteller. What pattern or patterns we used? You used a rule of 3. You talked about 3 books and you engaged the audience. You asked us questions. Did you read this one? Did you read that one? And you commented about what the responses are that you received. I thought it had a clear and definitive message that reading is fundamental and it's not just a way of getting through the virus. You also had the opportunity to share a little bit again about your background and how knowledgeable you are when it comes to speaking, because I know you have a little speaking club of your own. Thought you definitely spoke with confidence. That was absolutely evident throughout. Now, was this fact or opinion? Well, I think it was opinion, but it was a well thought out opinion. And what is the audience's reaction? That is my final question. The audience's reaction with applause or with thumbs up, that will gauge my comments on that area. I'm giving you a thumbs up and I'm turning control back to our general evaluator.